Hi, hello everyone, and welcome. Whether you're watching this webinar live online or you're watching its recording, my name is Adolfo Sanchez Cuadrado, and I'm a lecturer in linguistics here at the University of Granada, and I will be hosting this webinar today. Well, before introducing today's webinar and speaker, let me give you a bit of context. The Arqus Alliance, first of all, is a multilateral alliance of 9 institutions in the tertiary level, which share academic, scientific, and cultural objectives, a common vision of the role of higher education, and research and mutual fields of interests. Today's webinar is part of the guest lecture series 9 months, 9 universities offered in the framework of the Plurilingual and Intercultural Hub of the Alliance. This hub is one of the work packages or working groups of the Alliance, and it aims to promote plurilingualism within the 9 institutions and to capitalize on students, researchers, and staff's competence in different languages, as well as to foster their intercultural competence, one of the soft skills much needed for today's society. These lectures focus on specific topics related to language and culture and target mainly graduate and postgraduate students, as well as early stage researchers and also academic staff. So everyone is invited. The lectures are intended to generate awareness and appreciation for the topic of multilingualism, as well as an understanding of the many areas of our lives that are related to and influenced by language. So let me now introduce today's speakers. Professor, here she is, Professor Şebnem Bahadır-Berzig from the University of Graz. Good afternoon, Şebnem.
Hi, Adolfo. Good afternoon, everybody.
Hi. So Professor Bahadır-Berzig is a professor of translation studies. She's also deputy head of the department and co-spokesperson of the research area Translation, Migration, and Minorities at the Department of Translation Studies, co-spokesperson of the core topic area Multilingualism, Migration, and Cultural Transformation at the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Graz. Her main research interests are pedagogy, politics and ethics of translation and interpreting, public service interpreting, healthcare interpreting, migration, transcultural communication, and multilingualism. She's about to deliver the following webinar, Multilingual Communication in Spaces of Crisis, Taking for Granted, Secondary, or Essential for Survival. The webinar will focus on crises within the framework of natural and human-made disasters in linguistically and culturally diverse spaces. And Professor Bahadır-Berzig will discuss scenarios related to immediate rescue and aid measures after natural earthquakes, and also on mental health care interventions in spaces of crisis, both against the background of forced, in brackets, migration and of natural disasters. I don't want to take much time of the webinar. She will also comment on some collaboration between members of the Arqus Alliance, but I'm going to give her the screen. Thank you very much, Şebnem, for being with us today. Just one tiny thing before you start your presentation. I would like to remind everyone in the audience that you can leave any comments or questions you may have in the comments box for the Q&A section at the end of the webinar. And yeah, thank you very much once again, Şebnem, and the screen is yours.
Thank you, Adolfo, for this very kind introduction. So now, well, you just summarized my talk, but as it is always a very open-ended, well, let's say, discussion with the researcher herself, this preparing a webinar or a contribution, a talk. I think I have made some changes to this summary I had submitted before, but we'll see. I have put a slightly different focus, stress on my talk today, but actually the general framework is the same, and you have just listened, or Adolfo just read out my title. I will then go over to my motivation, rather, or my starting point for choosing such a topic for this webinar series. Of course, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me and for presenting this topic, which is quite essential, vital, critical for me nowadays in my teaching and also in my research. So you just you mentioned all my research interests and the areas I'm interested or I work in, both in teaching and in research. I just wanted to put it on this first slide, as a starting slide. The research focus generally for me is the pedagogy, ethics, and politics of interpreting. And this area, this focus, has a lot to do with the new focus now coming in, which is interpreting or multilingual communication, rather, in settings or spaces of crisis. When I look back, then everything I did until, or I have been doing until now, somehow is related to crises. When we look at community interpreting, public service interpreting, healthcare interpreting, with special focus on mental health, and also with a special highlighting of non-professional interpreting. And then what is very important for me, what has been very important for me up to now and is very important in this new topic now, and the research project collaboration to come. I will go into this research collaboration, as Adolfo just mentioned, with partners, Arqus colleagues, very precious Arqus colleagues. The focus is on the agents in the field in the context of forced migration, of any kind of migratory movements. So agency is in the foreground, but also the training and education of interpreters and of all those who work with interpreters. Here, capacity building plays a major role, consciousness raising, and then this very overarching topic of ethics of interpreting, where I have been trying to question all these, let's say, very valuable or cherished norms like neutrality, impartiality, and I have been trying to investigate into activism, committedness, involvement, and detachment. So as a larger framework, there is always migration and integration politics and policies, the larger scheme, and the politics of interpreting in the background. I wanted to somehow embed what I want to present now into this general framework of my research agenda, and then go over to my motivation. It's a very personal motivation, first of all. And it's not only the earthquake in Turkey and Syria just around about 1 year ago, a bit longer than 1 year ago, but it is, I think, mainly this very, very big earthquake that somehow shook me, that led to a major crisis with me in my researcher's identity or researcher's reflections and positioning. So you might have heard, and I'm sure you had heard of this very big earthquake. I'm for a very long time connected with colleagues, both in the academia, at universities in Turkey, different universities, and also amongst colleagues, amongst those interpreting in the field, or serving as multilingual actors, agents in the field of earthquakes and after. So they are somehow also the reason, or my connection to them is the reason behind my motivation to focus much more on interpreting or multilingual communication in general in crisis settings. So the starting point is definitely, of course, this positioning as a researcher, looking into this very vital and let's say ubiquitous area of multilingual communication. The focus is on the interpreter as agent in disasters, emergency settings, spaces of crisis. And here I want to put in the foreground and as the starting point, let's say an organization of interpreters, emergency and disaster interpreters. The name in Turkish is Afette Rehber Çevirmen. So this organization was founded in 1999, way back, right after the very big earthquake in that year. But the earthquake last year was even much bigger. So, you can read it from my slide. This organization was founded 1999 in the aftermath of the devastating earthquakes in the Marmara region, which is in the north of Turkey, is an initiative that provides and coordinates the interpreting services at disasters and emergencies on a voluntary basis. And it's important that here this organization had chosen to call themselves emergency and disaster interpreters. I'm going to dwell upon this differentiation in a minute when I go into a new area of the very exciting area of crisis translation within translation studies. So ARCH developed into an organization serving in cooperation with the Civil Defense Directorate in Istanbul at the time after the first training seminars held at the beginning of 2000 at the Faculty of Letters in Istanbul University. In those years, I have been, I was in Istanbul as well, so I also participated in these initiatives, especially training initiatives. I know my colleagues for a very long time, but as I'm not now based in Istanbul, it has not been a very close connection up to last year, actually. So ARCH composed an organizational structure that enabled its volunteer workforce of interpreters to be prepared for quick emergency and disaster response. This is very important, response. This is the first phase after a disaster happened. So it is also written in the ethical code of ARCH that they work as volunteer interpreters for the first 2 weeks. And then afterwards, another structure of collaboration starts. So you have also the websites here. You can look into them. There's some text in English. Most of them are in Turkish. But there is also research done by my colleagues. So my colleagues Alev Bulut, Turgay Kurultay, Aymil Doğan, are to be mentioned here, and there are also younger researchers like Rabia Odabaşı, and of course very well in the center of the work and the research nowadays done by Rana Kahraman Duru. So there are some articles published by our colleagues in Turkey about this phenomenon, this organization, this emergency reaction by professional and unprofessional, non-professional interpreters, and especially with a very strong connection to certain departments of translation in Istanbul, Ankara, in the larger urban areas, also in Izmir. In the first days of this organization, they called themselves Interpreters in Aid at Disasters, but then it changed into Emergency and Disaster Interpreters. So you can have a look there, especially our colleagues report about their very valuable and precious experiences all throughout, well, beginning from 1999 up to this disastrous earthquake last year. And these articles are getting much more let's say attention in the last years, but still they are not that much present in translation studies or in the newly established and well, very much highlighted area of crisis translation or translation in crisis settings. So for me, it was important for me and my team, and I'm also talking for myself and my team here at Graz. I have a wonderful team, colleagues, just also very much interested in this topic, and I'm going to present, as I already mentioned, a project that we now engendered or have set into motion within the Arqus framework. So we think that there is much more potential to have these voices of interpreters or multilingual communicators, mediators, communication experts, and also researchers from the field, like from the field of disasters in Turkey, that their voices are much more heard, and that they that we look much more into these fields, much closer into these fields. So that was a very important starting point. So I mentioned that there is a new interdisciplinary area in translation studies becoming more and more important and gaining more and more interest in research or in the theory, in the theoretical realm of translation studies and research, but also I think in the education, in the training of translators and interpreters. The students are also very interested in this area. So, for example, this semester I started with a seminar, a research seminar, and applied course, an interpreting course on emergency and disaster interpreting, and the students are really very much interested. So this new interdisciplinary area, it's entitled rather Translating Crises or Crisis Translation, and it can be put under the general roof of multilingual communication in crisis settings. And there is also this as the area colleagues in Turkey, for example, are very much involved with. There is within this larger framework the emergency and disaster interpreting as topic. So you have here important research listed. I think it's really it's worth to look into these valuable publications. There has been also a very important EU-financed research project, the International Network on Crisis Translation Interact. And when we look into this research literature, there is a lot of interdisciplinary exchange, a lot of interdisciplinary collaboration and cooperation, very precious, very important, and a sine qua non for research in this area. And then there is also a lot of precious work done in the area of developing recommendations, looking at models of aid or response to emergency situations, and trying to incorporate multilingual communication needs and much more highlighted maybe translation needs and interpreting needs into these models and programs. So, for example, we have, I would like to present you, even read out a definition by our translation studies colleague Federici in cooperation with colleagues from other disciplines. I want to look into this definition of crisis a little bit closer, because I would like to then continue and try to reflect upon, let's say, other or a bit more theoretical deliberations on this concept of crisis, because crisis is a very exciting, very mind-opening, research opening concept, but it's at the same time a concept that is quite challenging. Well, maybe you'll understand what I mean when I just go on with my presentation, my talk. So we're looking into this, and we have a similar definition in Sharon O'Brien and Federico Federici's publications. Before this publication, this more recent one in 2023. So crises are triggered by one or multiple hazards. So this is one of the most important reasons why O'Brien and Federici and other colleagues decide to use crisis and not emergency or disaster. So it's a much larger and more encompassing concept. Crises are triggered by one or multiple hazards. Hazards can be geomorphological. That means, well, this is a more scientific expression for earthquakes, volcanoes, flooding, and all the natural catastrophes around. Biological, like viral epidemics or pandemics, like the COVID experience we just have experienced. Technological, like cyber attacks, electricity blackouts, and so on. Or teleological, that means conflicts, terrorism, wars, and so on. They all have in common the necessity to communicate risks to people exposed to crises in timely, accurate, and efficient ways. And this is very important, that you have the situation just breaking into the lives, into the, let's say, the flow of actions, normal actions of lives, and then they are exposed to this break, and they need information. They need information about the risks and how to help to overcome these risks in timely, accurate, and efficient ways. Fundamentally, affected people have the irrefutable right to seek information that is relevant to them. Such information should ideally be provided in formats, languages, means, and channels that are accessible, and this is something fixed by the WHO, the World Health Organization. There is a need to establish strong channels of multi-directional communication and to circulate trustworthy information that can reduce, mitigate, or avoid threats and risks. So here we see that multilingual communication, and especially translation, can be seen, and Federici and O'Brien proposed this approach very, well, let's say strongly. Within this framework, translation can be seen or should be seen as risk reduction in order to reduce harm and manage cascading crises. And cascading is a very interesting adjective or characteristics for crises. That means that cascading is refers to the complexity of a crisis in comparison now to emergency. So crisis rather than disaster or emergency translation is preferred because crises, according to Federici and O'Brien, stress that what is happening is non-linear, multidimensional, with a very high level of complexity, and that there are chain effects of vulnerabilities, and that there are different needs and also possibilities of multilingual communication in the three main phases of the aftermath of a disaster. That means the phases of immediate response, resilience, which means in this phases the strength of the community is somehow reestablished or is tried to be reestablished, and then recovery. So languages are already and always there. This is a very important point. We have this crisis situation. Yeah, this crisis situation is breaking in, but the language needs are not breaking in at that moment, or the language diversity. The language diversity is there in these regions, and these regions we have to look at very attentively. So languages are already and always there in multilingual spaces of crisis. And with this simple statement, I want to connect to my subtitle. So the question whether multilingual communication or the provision of translation, interpreting, as I said, multilingual communication in general, then the question whether this is secondary vis-a-vis the urgency of aid or the urgency of the need of aid, or whether this is taken for granted or a nuisance or a luxury, these questions somehow become superfluous, redundant. Okay, so you have the languages over there, so they have to be taken into account. And it's very important to see here that the power of the language has a very important power here. Language access here is to be seen as a human right in multilingual spaces of crisis for the mitigation of risk and casualties. So you can't take, you can't make a difference between there is the urgent need of, I don't know, medical help, or help to rebuild housing, or hygienic, to re-establish hygienic conditions or whatever. It is intertwined. You have the language need intertwined with any other aid measure. So the power of translation and interpreting, whether human interpreters, and you have here the power not only of language, but also the power of reaching out for these languages, reaching them via translation and interpreting. And here, for the first moment of reflection, it's important to recognize that it doesn't matter for this first moment whether we talk of human interpreters, whether professional trained citizen interpreters, community interpreters, it doesn't matter, or even machine translation. And there have been quite a few wonderful publications on the possibilities and on the use of machine translation, or the use of information and communication technologies in different disasters like the Haiti earthquake. So it's clear. The clear thing is, so I want to stress this and to put this as a major statement in the middle of my talk, not at the end, but right now, that that language and the provision of multilingual communication is essential for survival, because, and that's very important, the aid is most often coming from outside the language communities, and this aid, or these aid measures, are to be framed in translation and multilingual communication. So now I want to make a cut, or let's say it's like a very big digression, because I would like to invite you to reflect with me a little bit on a theoretical level on the concept of crisis. Of course, we have just read out the very practical, usable definition of crisis in the research on crisis translation, coming from different research areas, and also studies in disaster management, psychology, psychiatry, and so on. But still, I think this concept of crisis needs to be reflected upon within translation studies, once more from a more theoretical, or from a research perspective, translation studies research perspectives. And there, in this connection, I want to refer to some inspirations I got from other disciplines. It's very vital, essential to stress the need to reflect upon this concept on a interdisciplinary level. So I won't go into many details, but I want to pinpoint some texts, or I think one text for each discipline. For sociology, I have brought with me one text that inspired me, and for psychology another, and for philosophy a third one. So there is a text by a sociologist called Steg in Germany, where I think we can refer to in order to see that crises as chance and potential to overcome a critical situation and to develop innovative ways of handling something unknown and at first sight negative is very important for our understanding of crisis when we speak of crisis translation. And this is also found in the, this is also already found in the research on crisis translation by the colleagues I have just mentioned a few minutes ago. So what is also important here is that there is a certain ubiquity of crises and discourses on crises in modern or postmodern times. So this is a critical point we also have to dwell upon. What happens if we talk a lot about crises? Everywhere there are crises, and I just mentioned that as well, referring to my research activities up to now. So I have the feeling that I have just conducted research and reflected upon and taught in my teaching on crises all the time when dwelling upon community interpreting or public service interpreting. So what happens then? Then you have something like it becomes redundant to talk about crises if everything is crisis. So we have to think about that. This is something like this is an idea telling us that we have to be cautious. And then there is this aspects of semantic ambiguity. It's so difficult to fix what a crisis actually is. And at the same time, with this difficulty to fix, there is a striking connectivity. So we can connect to many, many other phenomena. So we have this phenomenon of insecurity, dynamism, openness, unintendedness, and so on and so forth. So still connecting to the idea of the ubiquity of crises, it is also very often discussed in sociology. For example, there are two very fascinating thinkers, sociologists in Germany as well, Nasehe and Reckwitz, who who write about crisis as different from normality, as well as the new norm. So it's not only different from normality, it is the new norm. And they just talk about normal and normalies, which I find a very striking expression, and which I will refer to later on again. And what is very important here, the last point, following from this discussion of what a crisis is, anyhow, crises are politically contested processes. So you don't have objective measures just pinpointing that this is a crisis for now and for all the time and for all countries and for everywhere and for all people. So these processes are politically contested, and the concept and the talking on it, the discussion on it, is also politicized and politically largely instrumentalized. I will leave now the sociological reflection and go over just to present you some inspirations I got from the discipline of psychology, which is called the discipline of problems. The discipline of sociology is most often called, since its beginnings with Auguste Comte, as the discipline of crises, or the major motivation of sociology in the earlier days, in the beginnings, was to look at the crises in human in social entities, in societies. So we have now psychology as the discipline of problems, and medicine, the mother discipline of the concept of crisis. Actually, crisis is a concept coming from medicine, where I want to refer to a text by a Greek psychologist and researcher in psychology, Dafermos. Here we have this idea that we have to historicize and politicize the concept, or see what I just mentioned, the politically instrumentalized side of crisis. And he refers to Marx. I won't go into the details, but I think it's very interesting reading to look at Marx, how he sees that, how he proposes or even defends the necessity of crises. And then there is this very interesting idea of Gramsci, also, basing on his readings of Marx, where he describes the state of crisis as interregnum, as something in between, and the times and states of the zombies. Dafermos stresses that there is a need for dialectical thinking on crisis to recognize the transformative potential. So we have to look at the positive and the negative at the same time, always. And it's also very important to just remember the origins of the term crisis. As I just mentioned, it's in medicine. It originates from the ancient Greek verb krinein, krinein, that means to separate, distinguish, judge, or to decide. In the ancient Greek language, the word krisis means the critical point or critical phase in the development of a disease. That is the point at which a patient is judged to live or die. So this is very important, and it will be repeated in the philosophical discussion as well. So when we look into philosophy, I will just take one philosopher out of this very long tradition of talking or reflecting upon crisis. I will look a little bit into the deconstruction because we can connect it very well to this colleague from the area of psychology. So crisis in the philosophy of deconstruction shows us that major characteristics of crisis are undecidability, ambiguity, and menace to security, stability, stagnation. So very important is that crisis refers to the unknown, to the uncanny, and in German, well, referring to Heidegger rather, we talk about the unheimlich, the adjective of being unheimlich. So crisis, both in the sense of a determinate event occurring at the present time and requiring responsible action, and alternatively as an uncanny structure introducing alterity in the very heart of the present. So we have here another Greek colleague, Piero Volaki, who refers to Derrida and, quotes Derrida, who asks, who is talking about crisis? Who is talking the most about it right now? Where, to whom, in what form, in view of what effects and what interests, by playing on what representations? So Piero Volaki stresses that it's very important to look into these questions by Derrida in order to decide upon the effects of crisis. We have to ask who is talking about crisis, who is who is generating a discourse about crisis. So, well, the quote goes, continues, it is definitely one thing to theorize about the causes and effects of the crisis of, say, global capitalism or earthquakes or, global military conflicts. It is quite another to be a real victim of the crisis due to the implementation of capitalist policies of outsourcing and offshoring, or the implementation of policies of relief and response and recovery and so on, actually deprived of direct access to any decision-making centers or even to the public debate. So who is deciding upon what is a crisis and what to do about this crisis? Within this context, so for me, it's very important that we ask ourselves some critical questions. Who is conducting research on crisis? Who decides and who is entitled to talk why and how and when on crisis in research, but also in society, politics, economy? We have now all these areas in the research in sociology and psychology and philosophy. So I think it's very important. I was so fascinating by a text by, by a colleague from the Philippines, Kadak. I don't know how to pronounce. I'm going to find it out. This text dwells upon the need for decolonizing not only disasters, but also disaster management and disaster research. So we have to ask ourselves the questions: what is vulnerability and safety, for whom, when, under which conditions? What is ambiguity and ambiguity reduction, control in linguistically and culturally diverse settings and spaces of crisis? And then further critical questions arise. And these questions we have to ask to the field. Who translates, interprets in spaces of crisis? Who knows and evaluates what they do and what they don't do? who trains them, how and why and when, who decides upon quality standards. Because nowadays in the research on crisis translation, this is a very important point, and it is undoubtedly a very important point. I don't question the importance of the question, of asking the question who decides, or asking the question about quality standards. But then we have to ask ourselves, who is asking this question about quality standards? And I go further, and I want to ask the question, which translator, interpreter, or multilingual communicator, mediator is capable of not only functioning instrumental, here I want to refer to this idea of instrumental thinking on translation and interpreting by my colleague Dilek Dizdar. She tried to show in her publication 2014 that there is a tendency, not only in the industry, but also in translation studies and translator education, that we stress on this instrumental characteristics of translation, that it has to fulfill an aim, and that it is, well, I see a very close connection to be a part of a larger scheme, to function. But isn't it also necessary to ask the question, which translator, interpreter is capable also of actively contributing to risk mitigation, response, but also to resilience and recovery, these phases after a crisis as agents? And then there is this big question, do we know enough about all these translators and interpreters, human or non-human, professional or community, the citizen? So we have a really urgent need for more field work in these spaces and with these agents. That would be my very important conclusion out of these reflections. And concerning interpreting and also translation, I'm a bit more concentrating on interpreting, because that's my area of research and training and education, rather than translation as well. But I think whatever I try to say here on interpreting is also valid for translation. So interpreting in setting spaces of crisis for human beings in crisis, by human beings formerly and maybe still in crisis. So we have this crisis situation affecting all agents in this multilingual communication situation. So then I would like to discuss much more also the question about what interpreting means in these settings. Isn't interpreting and translation itself as activity, as an intervention, as a happening in these spaces comparable to crisis? Doesn't interpreting also show all the characteristics of crisis itself, or isn't it comparable to crisis? And there the common characteristics like disruption and decidability, ambiguity, in-betweenness, coupled with the demand for rapid response. So there is a real paradox, dialectical movement within interpreting. So you have this disruptive situation of interpreting, of multilingualism, and then you have it coupled with the demand for rapid response, for decision-making, and action due to emergency. And I think it's very important for us on the level of trying to profit from research in these areas as translation scholars or translation theorists. I think this can lead us to very fruitful questioning of the normal norms of mostly professionally interpreting, of any interpreting and translation. So the questioning of these norms so cherished, like neutrality, impartiality, objectivity, and detachment, and the revisiting of the so-called anomalies of mostly professional, but also non-professional interpreting, such as committedness, advocacy and involvement. So the requirement, even directed towards non-professional interpreting, is always related to committedness, or the demand for non-committedness, non-advocacy, and non-involvement. So I had promised to go into some concrete scenarios. I see that my time is just flying away, so therefore I will just pinpoint some of this myriad of scenarios, spaces, and agents of multilingual communication in settings of crisis, because I also want to go into our initiative to establish a research community and collaboration within the network, Arqus network. So we have a lot of situations, and maybe in the discussion we can go into the details of concrete situations or concrete scenarios. So you have the daily routine procedures in refugee camps all over the world, interpreted and communicated by bilingual staff, volunteers, community members, sometimes also very seldom by professional interpreters if there are very big international organizations at work. So you have very precious research done on this already. Well, not all over, and not so much from the perspective of the afflicted, of the involved. On migration routes on the Mediterranean Sea on boats, for example, when arriving at European coasts or other coasts. Multilingual communication, mostly by rudimentary information and communication technology. So you have here the situation where you have non-human agents, and that is something where we have very recent and rare research dwelling upon. And then we have this, for me, fascinating area on which I concentrate much more, is the mental health care after disasters, wars, forced migration, any kind of migration. We have asylum hearings settings, or after earthquakes, that was my starting point, and similar natural disasters at any stage of the phases, response, resilience, and recovery. And this mental health care is also a very important point in the phase of resilience after earthquakes, like trauma therapy, and well, even before therapy, just to find out whether there is a trauma, whether trauma can be diagnosed. So I have 3 dots here, and I would be very happy to discuss concrete scenarios with well, the persons attending this webinar, or with Adolfo maybe. So, but at the end, following my plea, my call for more research in the fields, and from the perspective of the persons in the fields doing this multilingual communication work. Within this framework, I would like to present, as the last point, an initiative we started in Graz with colleagues in other, I will just tell in which Arqus universities in the Arqus network. So we have, well, we had applied for an ad hoc bottom-up initiative finance budget, and we got it. So we have now a network established. We are now in the establishing phase of a network on the topic of research network, on the topic of multilingualism in spaces of crisis, and concentrating on the impact of human and non-human agency. The research field at the moment is very broad. We're going to then have sub-teams and sub-projects, but now we want to establish a larger network. We just, put multilingual communication in disaster and emergency response, particularly translation and interpreting in the context of crisis communication after a natural disaster, in an armed conflict, or in sea rescue situations, any human-made or natural emergency situation. Then our focus in this research network, and as research network, or we want to work on different phases of collaboration. We want to apply for projects on EU level, but also on national levels. So we want to focus on minority and refugee language communities, and especially on the members of these communities, involving them into our research network in linguistic, cultural, and politically complex regions of conflict and disaster characterized by rich cultural and linguistic diversity. So these are our colleagues. This is our network for the time being. It has just started. We had just one online meeting, and we are very happy. We would be very happy if we grow very fast as network. So you see, University of Granada is part of this network, Maynooth University, Minho, and Graz, and you can see our colleagues here participating. There are teams, for example. I'm not the only one. I have a very committed team. So maybe very shortly, our aims and research questions. Our aims can be summarized into one aim, one very big aim. It's the aim to empirically understand how language barriers are overcome in disaster situations. So to go into the fields, that's very, very important for us. And then there is this subset of aims. What are the communication requirements and solutions provided in context of multilingual crisis and communication? Who are the human and non-human agents making multilingual communication possible in these contexts? So for us, it's very important to include professional interpreters, language technologies, ad hoc mediators, bilingual responders, bilingual rescue workers, members of local or international NGOs, governmental representatives, bilingual medical staff, and so on and so forth. It will show in time who is going to be ready or enthusiastic about joining us. So and the third sub aim is which multilingual practices are performed by these agents. So we will look into the practices, and that's very important. We will look into these practices without setting a definite definition of what, a fixed definition of what multilingual communication should look like. So different forms of interpreting, machine translation, translanguaging, transcultural mediation. We hope to somehow, describe or get to know by looking into the field. Methodologically, we want to work not only, but very with a large focus on participatory action research. Participants from the field are vital for us. Collaboration through dialogue and exchange amongst all the people we are going to invite to our network from different countries, from the countries of the colleagues, of the researchers within this network, but also from other countries. We are going to reach out, hopefully, to other countries as well. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to discuss with you not only now, but also in future within a research collaboration. That would be great. And yes, I have taken quite a lot of your time, but I do hope that it was worth.
Hi, Şebnem. No problem at all. No worries, absolutely, because your webinar was so interesting that I'm sure that the audience have enjoyed it and have learned a lot from it. So no problem at all. Okay, well, so thank you. Let's wait for some questions or comments for some seconds now, because we have this delay with the YouTube channel. We have greetings for you from Portugal, from Fernando Ferreira.
Oh, thank you, Fernando. Yes, he's also
part of the project. You are conventional.
Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So yeah, let's wait for a couple of seconds. So thank you very much for this webinar. I mean, not only you shared your expertise on the topic, you also commented on these future plans of research with us. So very, very, very interested. You gave us some good insight on translation in these contexts, interpreting in these contexts. Thank you very much for my opinion to give, to make the role of translators and interpreters more visible, because sometimes the role is not visible at all, and you gave a good way to make it more visible. They're not on the news, they're not on the movies actually normally, so they are there helping in those situations. So thank you very much.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. This visibility is very important, and it's not only visibility. I think it's also very important to make to give them the chance to just speak out and to become voices speaking out, because there is quite a lot of research. There has been quite a lot of research done in translation and in community interpreting studies for the last 20, even 30 years. Which all dwelt upon this aspects of problem of visibility and also recognition. But I think now we need a next step to go. We have to include all these agents into our research agendas. And that means that we have to go much more often into these areas, into these fields, and talk to them and have exchange with them and discuss with them. And I think therefore we need these networks like the one we are going now to establish.
Absolutely, I agree. Totally, I agree with you. It's not only a question of being effective as a translator or interpreter, but being considered. I really loved your concept here to be considered as an agent in these situations. I mean, translators and interpreters are there as agents. They exert their agency in these situations, and they make decisions, and they help make decisions, and they preempt this cascade of consequences. So I really love that concept. Okay, so we have a question from Maya A, probably the answer, the surname. So she's asking about interpreters education training. So how can this topic be highlighted more in interpreters training or education? Aside from talking about it in general, as you do in your seminar, what are competencies that are sometimes overlooked in education?
Okay, thank you very much, Maya, for your question. Actually, this is something that is very intriguing for me and vital for the development of the curricula for next generation translators and interpreters, because we discuss about so many interesting areas and topics in our research seminars, in our theoretical seminars, but I think it would be very fruitful and also eye-opening, maybe body-opening for our interpreting students if they get the chance to work with these scenarios, to get into these scenarios, to not only by way of role plays or by way of simulations, but actually I try to do this in a course now at Graz. It's just the beginning, because I work with theater pedagogical methodology with Augusto Boal, for example, with the legislative theater as a method, or the forum theater, where students, and I work on very simple scenarios of crises after disasters. And I can see even from this first experiment now that it's very, that it is important for students getting an education in public service interpreting, for example, like we have this specialization in Graz, that they go into this very extreme situation, and then they experience that it's not just, of course, terminology is very important. Don't understand me wrongly. Of course, it's very important to transfer each and every sentence as it was said by this person. But there are so many other competencies we need as interpreters and intercultural mediators. And then the most important thing is the interpreter herself, how I, or the interpreter as body, as person, as personality, as a person with a whole background on her shoulders. You know, you don't go as a professional interpreter stripped off any background or whatever into this situation. And these crisis situations show the students something very important, that they act there not only as professionals intellectually from their, you know, intellectual capacities or their competences they have learned intellectually, but as bodies and persons with backgrounds, with histories. And also sometimes I can even now discern this in my course, in my applied course. It's even much better to try to interpret. In German, we say out of your stomach, out of your belly, so aus dem Bauch heraus, because students have so many potentials they bring into the courses, and so they learn to get to know themselves much better in this crisis situation. And also they learn about their emotions, about their limits, about their potentials, about their resources, whatever. So therefore, we should include these exercises even in the education of conference interpreters. I'm a conference interpreter as well. So I think even there it's very important, because it's so decisive in getting to know your limits and your potentials.
Great. Okay, I don't know if Maya has a comment on that, but yeah, it's an exciting view on translation training. Yeah, not to focus just on the cognitive level, but also on the personal, affective, interpersonal, intercultural. So as you said, you know, we have as translators, interpreters, we have a background, we have a life, we have a way of seeing things, especially in these delicate situations. You know, as you said, crisis. It's a very good situation, no, for to work on those aspects too. Okay, so I don't know. Well, in focusing on this aspect, you mentioned that you mentioned a lot of settings you work with, but you mentioned that you sort of specialize on mental health care after disasters. And now mental health nowadays is becoming more and more on the spotlight. I mean, it's gaining momentum here in Spain, for example. I guess it's the same there in Austria. I don't know. It's something people are becoming more and more aware of. So connecting this to translation and interpreting training too, do you find as a translator, interpreter, trainer that your students come with a good background on mental health nowadays, that, or maybe better than before, or I don't know, because it's not a topic much discussed, that has been much discussed earlier, but it's gaining momentum, as I said. So how do you find your translation and interpreting students regarding this topic?
Thank you very much for this question. It connects to the previous question very easily, because I think interpreting in mental health is also a very situation where students can experience what it means to be vulnerable. This vulnerability, or this, there we have a crisis situation which is very personal, very existential. And I think there as well, it's a very important exercise in awareness building, in capacity building, rather awareness building, that students should go somehow through. I would like to compare this with the education of psychotherapists or psychologists. Actually, they themselves as well have to confront with their own histories, with their own her stories, her background. So when working in courses, when just enacting, I call my method interpreting enactments, when we enact situations where, so in psychotherapy or psychosocial counseling, it is not only that the students somehow negotiate with situations of vulnerability concerning the client, the person for whom they interpret. They are very much challenged in their professional attitude, because there is this big thing of becoming too much involved, of developing this helper syndrome. Or then the other extreme is that this over-identification of whatever, or even fear and disgust. And there is this whole emotional load. And again, it is an area where students learn to recognize that it's not only rational, this interpreting they do, it's the whole body, it's the whole emotional set. And it's also very important for learning how to regulate our emotions, because of course I do not propose that all interpreters should cry and be emotional and whatever, hug all the clients in need. That shouldn't be understood like that. But I think in education, in training at the university, we have this protected area where we could dwell in a, let's say, it's not so fast as in the field, but we could dwell upon each and every moment of this emotional involvement and think about it and freeze the moment, and then think about, what does this interpreting situation do with me, do to me, and what do I to this situation? I have also had several courses on mental health care interpreting. For me, for example, I think this is very important. These areas are not to be involved into the curriculum to make absolute experts out of our students. That we couldn't do within an interpreting education or training. But the students should be aware what they need further. For example, some training in psychotherapy. We work with NGOs actually in Graz, where they can get this training in the basics of psychotherapy, and where they can get supervision, for example. That's very important, because we can't do everything to professionalize them, to make expert mental health care interpreters out of them. Because there's so many areas. I think the most important thing is on a level, let's say on a macro level, that we somehow show them how to protect themselves, how to develop themselves, and how to, that's the most important thing for me, and that happens very often when I teach mental health care interpreting, how to say no. This is not the area where I'm the appropriate interpreter for, in which I'm the appropriate interpreter for. I wouldn't do this job. I wouldn't take this job. It's not good for me. And anything that is not good for me is not good for my clients.
Mm-hmm. Good. Great. Thank you very much. Well, I think we still have time for one final question, since we have it in the chat. It's from Ines Sauer. First, she thanks you for your thought-provoking presentation, and then she asks about more information about the participatory approach and the methods you will be working with.
Okay, thank you, Ines. I think she means she thinks of the participation of the research network. That is related to the research network, Arqus Research Network, and the steps after. Well, actually, we would like to first of all activate all our connections to the different fields. And I think all of the persons involved, we had this meeting last week, our first online meeting in this in this research collaboration network, and we have found out that we all have connections to the field, to agents in the field, but we have to somehow now try to include these persons with a much more active role, shaping our research agenda, our research questions. That we will try to do first with online meetings, trying to bring all different stakeholders now into these meetings. And then afterwards, if we need then budget and financing, we need research budgets in order to go to these stakeholders, to these agents in these different fields, in these different countries, and work with them. And we are not yet at that stage that we have discussed and negotiated about the concrete methodology to work with. But I think it's clear that we have to be very open for workshops, discussions, very creative measures to include the non-researchers into this research. We are working on that, and we will do a lot of methodological discussions in the next months to come, and there will be a major workshop in presence in Graz in autumn or in winter. That's our plan.
Okay, great. So if there are not any more questions or comments, I think that could be okay. Yeah, the moment to come to an end to this wonderful webinar. Well, thank you very much once again, Şebnem.
Thank you, Adolfo,
for sharing your time and expertise and knowledge about the topic with us.
Thank you very much for your moderation, for your questions, for your interest.
Thank you.
Thank you, all the organizers of this wonderful webinar. It's wonderful, really. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Şebnem. And thank you, everyone, for attending or watching this webinar at some point. Yeah, I invite you to join us or in our next webinar, or to watch the other webinars that are available on our webpage. So, well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a nice day.